Hello, and welcome back to our lecture series in anatomy. We are going to start on lecture 4 today. It will probably be 2 parts. This is going to be our first organ system. We're going to be talking about skin and the accessories to skin, and it's also called the integumentary system. Before we start actually talking about skin, I want to first take a moment to talk about membranes. So we are going to take our knowledge that we learned when we studied epithelial tissue, and we are going to take our knowledge from connective tissue, and we are going to combine the two to build our very first organ system. But to do that, we have to have a little bit of a background on membranes in the body. So this is a very specific term in anatomy, and it is comprised of 2 elements. So epithelial and connective tissue combine to form membranes, and each membrane consists of 2 elements. A sheet of epithelial cells, so this can be either a single layer or multiple layers. And then the second feature is that this epithelial layer sits on top of areolar connective tissue. All right, there may be other connective tissues present, but these are the 2 important features that make up a membrane. All right, there are 4 different types of membranes in our bodies, and we've encountered a couple of these already. So in our very first lecture, we talked about serous membranes. And we talked about how these serous membranes, they cover and line serous cavities of the body. So for example, we talked about the serous membrane that covers the heart. So I'm going to draw a heart. Not very well. And then we talked about that there was a serous membrane that was very close to the surface of the heart. So it was fused to the heart, and we called this the visceral serous membrane. And then there was a second membrane that connected or attached the heart to the body wall, and this one was called the parietal serous membrane. And in between the 2, there was serous fluid. And that these membranes and the serous fluid that was in between them allows the organ to move. So this reduces friction. So if we take a closer look at that, the membrane is made up of simple squamous epithelium. So I'm going to cross this term out because we haven't used this term. But this epithelia is a simple squamous epithelium. And deep to the epithelium is the areolar tissue. And those 2 components are what make up a membrane. I'm also going to take off this word because we haven't talked about this, but this is referring to the serous fluid. So another feature of membranes is that, or of epithelial tissue, is that these cells, the simple squamous epithelial cells, they are secreting serous fluid. And we talked about 3 different types of serous membranes, if you remember. We talked about, which is what I just drew, the pericardial serous membrane that surrounds the heart. We talked about the pleural serous membranes that surround each of the lungs. And then we talked about the peritoneum, that the abdominal pelvic region was also contained within a serous cavity and contains serous membranes. The second type of membrane is called a mucous membrane. The cells that line the membrane secrete mucus, which is a thick and viscous fluid that protects the layer of cells. So mucous membranes occur in various places of our body that are coming into contact with the outside world. So this means areas such as the digestive tract and the lungs. And the airway. So the type of epithelial cells vary with these mucous membranes, and it depends on where you are in the body. But there is still, so here it's showing these columnar, a simple columnar epithelium. What makes it a membrane is that deep to the epithelium, you find this areolar tissue. Okay, those are the two components that make up membranes. And then the third type of membrane are called synovial membranes. And we're actually going to spend a lot more time talking about synovial membranes when we talk about joints, because these types of membranes surround some of our very movable joints, and they secrete a fluid that lubricates the joint. So again, we're going to talk more about that when we get there, but the point is still the same, that what makes up this membrane is that there is an epithelium, and then deep to that, there is areolar tissue. And then finally, the last type of membrane, which actually is going to be the subject of this, the remaining part of the lecture, is called a cutaneous membrane. All right, and this is skin. So another word for skin is integument. The integumentary system consists of skin and hair and glands, and that is what we are going to be discussing in this lecture series. So this type of membrane, it also contains an epithelium, but this time, instead of it being a single layer, you are going to see that it is made up of a stratified squamous epithelium. So you can see the stratified squamous here. There are other types of cells that are in this epithelium, which we'll go over in more detail as we get there. But the point is there's an epithelium, and then deep to the epithelium is areolar tissue. So if we take a look at the actual histology, and you've seen this histology before because we have looked at skin when we were looking at areolar connective tissue and when we were looking at dense irregular connective tissue. So let me change my highlighter so that you can see this. So again, this is a histological representation of skin. The epithelium comes from here all the way to here. This is the stratified squamous epithelium. And then deep to the stratified squamous epithelium, I would say from about here. And then it's hard to kind of trace all of this, but all of this area in here, this is the areolar connective tissue. And then deep to the areolar connective tissue, to support skin and to give it its strength, you are going to find dense, irregular connective tissue. And again, this is what is going to provide skin with some strength to it. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and talk about the anatomy of skin. So let us first talk about the many functions of skin. So skin is the largest organ system of our body. And you remember it is made up of a cutaneous membrane, which is another word for skin. So I've outlined on this slide several of the important functions that skin has. So let's talk about it being a physical barrier first. So skin acts as a barrier to microbes, so that microbes or pathogens, fungi or bacteria do not enter our skin. It also protects us from mechanical and chemical damage. So mechanical meaning scrapes or bruises. It prevents the underlying tissue from being damaged, and also prevents chemicals from entering our body. There's also a role so skin plays to prevent water loss or gain. And then ultimately our skin also helps protect us from UV radiation. So a lot of things that are going on in the environment, our skin is protecting us against. One of the second major roles is thermoregulation. So this is carried out by a combination. I'm going to show you soon that there is an adipose tissue layer or fat within skin, and there are also blood vessels that are associated with skin, especially close to the surface. And so these vessels can be adjusted to dump heat into the environment or to retain heat. So for instance, if you work out or go outside on a hot day, you will look very flushed because you are opening up your capillary beds in the skin to dump heat. And you're probably also maybe a little wet from this because you are sweating, and we will talk about sweat glands later in the lecture. And on the flip side, if you go take a trip to Big Bear and you encounter snow, you may see that your hands are pale, and the blood vessels in the skin constrict so you don't cool the blood that is returning to your heart. So this is a very dynamic process that occurs within skin. The third role is that skin plays a role in excretion. So it's not a major role, but there are glands within the skin that help to eliminate waste, such as salt and other chemicals. And so that is why, if you're out exercising or you like the outdoors and you are sweating a lot, just drinking water may not hydrate you enough because you have lost some other chemicals. So you would need to drink something that would provide those kind of electrolytes back into your body. Fourth is that skin plays a role in the biosynthesis of vitamin D. So this is actually a combination of many different things. So it's a combination of UV radiation, your skin, and your liver. And vitamin D is critical for your bones. Next, we have a role in sensation. So the world around you interfaces with your skin. So there are many different types of receptors located on your skin to kind of monitor the outside environment. So there are temperature sensors, there's touch receptors, there's pain receptors. And these are all tied in with the nervous system. And a lot of these receptors are there so that we can understand what is going on in the outside environment. Next, we have a role of skin with lipid synthesis. So again, there is a layer of fat under the epidermis that I will show you later in the lecture. And this is a good source of energy. And then finally, there is a role of skin with immune surveillance. So there are lots of cells there that are on and in our skin to kind of intercept invaders that might come in contact with us. So let's start to look at what skin is made up of. And we're going to start in a simple way, and then we'll kind of get more and more detailed as we work through the lecture. So there are 3 distinct layers that make up skin. So it's divided into 3 layers. Excuse me. The epidermis, all right? The epidermis is the epithelium. And I'll show you that. The dermis, which is connective tissue. And then the hypodermis. This is also connective tissue. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So here is a nice image showing you the layers of skin. You have the epidermis here in green. That's this layer here. You have the dermis, that is mostly connective tissue, in red, and then the hypodermis, that is also connective tissue, here. So the epidermis consists of epithelial tissue, which is composed of keratinized, and I'm going to show you what that is and what that means, but it's basically a waterproofing agent. So the cells, the stratified squamous cells, are actually making keratin. And keratin is going to act as a waterproofing barrier, okay? And as we've talked about, the epidermis is avascular, right? There's no blood supply there. And it is composed of several layers. And we're going to take some time to dissect the epidermis and what exactly is going on in the epidermis in the slides to come. But this is just to give you an overview of the layers that we're going to start talking about. All right, next is the dermis. This is the majority of the thickness of skin. And you're going to see that this area also contains hair follicles and sweat glands, which we'll touch on at the last part of the lecture. The dermis is composed of 2 types of connective tissue. We have areolar connective tissue, which is deep to the epidermis, and then below that, deep to the areolar tissue, we have dense, irregular connective tissue. And I'm going to show you some histology slides in a minute so you can see what that looks like. And then the deepest layer is the hypodermis. And that consists of subcutaneous fat, which is adipose, and there's also a little bit of areolar connective tissue in the hypodermis as well. So it is important to understand what is in each of these layers. All right, let's take a closer look. So again, we are going to come back and talk about this epidermis here because there's actually a lot that goes on in the epidermis. But I want to give you some basics on some of the other layers first. So the dermis, as I mentioned, the dermis has 2 different types of connective tissue, and they have 2 different names. So the papillary layer right here is made up of areolar connective tissue, okay? And then the reticular layer is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. And you can usually tell the division of these 2 layers when you're looking at it under the microscope. So the dermis, again, this is the second layer. This is a strong, flexible layer. It has a lot of connective tissue in it. It is supplied with blood vessels and nerves in the dermis as well. Here is a histology view, a histological section of skin. So you can see right here what's stained darker, is the epidermis. Okay, and again, we are going to talk about the epidermis in great detail because there's actually a lot going on in the epidermis. Deep to the epidermis in red, you can see the areolar connective tissue. okay? And you remember that the areolar connective tissue contains all three fibers that we had talked about: collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. And then deep to the areolar connective tissue, which is what is in yellow, is the dense irregular connective tissue, which is what is going to give skin its strength. So that is made up of collagen fibers going in a lot of different directions. All right, and then finally, I want to just make mention of the hypodermis. I have a feeling that during my airdrop, I lost all the text here. So let me pause this and take a look at it. But the hypodermis is made up of adipose tissue and a little bit of areolar connective tissue. All right, so I want to take a minute, and what we want to do right now is spend some time talking about the layers of the epidermis, okay? Because this is very important, and I want to make sure that you understand what is going on with the epidermis. So there are several layers that make up the epidermis, and they have very distinct names. So cells are going to go through a transformation in their form, in their anatomy, and in their function as they move up and head towards the top. So they are going to shed, they're going to die and shed. So all the cells here at the top are dead cells. Okay. And then this bottom layer right here is where all of the epidermal cells are coming from. So that is where the mitosis is going to occur. So let me go through the names of the epidermis, and then I'm going to tell you the features of each of these layers. Okay, they are called stratums right here. These stratums are layers to the epidermis. So each of these layers has a name, and there are different things that are going on in each of these layers that I want to talk about. So let me go over, because I actually have a mnemonic for you to help you memorize the layers of the epidermis. So the deepest layer is the stratum basale. Okay, so let me tell you the names of the layers and the mnemonic, and then I'll tell you what's going on in each of these layers. So the stratum basale is just a single layer. It's the deepest layer. It is a single layer of cuboidal cells. Okay, the next layer is the stratum spinosum. That's a pretty large area here. This is the stratum spinosum. And then you find the stratum granulosum. And it has this name, granulosum, because under the microscope, you can see little granules in this layer. The next layer is the stratum lucidum. This is called lucidum because it's lucid, it's clear, it's a very clear layer, and it's only found in one type of skin, which I'll explain soon, which is called thick skin. And then the topmost layer is the stratum corneum. That is the most superficial layer, and that is all dead cells. All right, that's the stratum corneum. So the mnemonic that I'm going to give you to help you memorize these layers, and then again, I'm going to go over what is happening in each layer, is the following. Beautiful skin gets love and care. So the B in beautiful is for stratum basale. The S in skin is for stratum spinosum. All right, so S is for spinosum, G is for the stratum granulosum, L is for stratum lucidum, and the C is for stratum corneum. So this mnemonic should help you memorize the different layers and the way that they are organized. So they are organized, the stratum basale is the deepest, and the stratum corneum is the most superficial. So I'm going to next talk about the types of cells that are present within the layers and what is going on in each of the layers. So this is a really nice representation of the different cell types that you can find in each of these layers. So let's talk about each of these layers, starting with the stratum basale. So within the stratum basale, and there's a cell type that's not listed here that I'm going to write over here on the side, are keratinoblast. Whenever you see the word blast compared to cytes, this cell has the ability to divide and become another cell. So keratinoblast become my goodness, I really messed that up. Sorry about that. Can become keratinocytes. So in the stratum basale, that is where mitosis and division is going to occur, and that is the layer that is going to produce all of the other cells. And so the cells are going to migrate to the top. They're going to start with division in the stratum basale, and as the keratinocytes begin to mature, they will begin to migrate to the surface of the skin. So the skin, as we talked about, has a regenerative capacity. So it can regenerate itself, and it needs to regenerate itself because we shed a lot of skin. And so the layer that is responsible for the mitosis and the regeneration of skin is the stratum basale. There are a few important cells in the stratum basale, and I have all of this written out in the next few slides, so you don't have to worry about frantically trying to write this all down. They are coming, but I just wanted to show it to you in diagram format rather than reading it all to you. So in the stratum basale, you're going to have keratinoblasts and keratinocytes, all right? And the keratinoblasts are going to be making new keratinocytes, all right? And they produce keratin. That is what is the waterproofing agent that is going to end up at the top layer, the most superficial layer of skin. Within the stratum basale, you can also find two other types of cells. You can find Merkel cells. All right, and in the beginning, I told you how it was very important. One of the functions of skin was to detect sensation. So Merkel cells are involved. They are associated with sensory neurons so that they function in the sensation of touch. So if we're sitting at a park and we feel an ant crawling on our skin, those are the Merkel cells transmitting that sensation to our brain so that we can interpret that feeling. The other cell type that you will find in the stratum basale, and unfortunately this diagram doesn't put it exactly in the stratum basale, is the melanocytes. But I am going to circle this cell, and we are going to put an arrow here to indicate that the melanocyte is in the stratum basale. A melanocyte is what contributes to producing melanin, which contributes to the skin, our skin color, and helps us with UV light absorption. Okay, so those are the cells that are located within the stratum basale. When we move to the stratum spinosum, this layer is predominantly made up of keratinocytes. So predominantly means the main cell type in the stratum spinosum are the keratinocytes. Okay, those are all of these pink reddish cells right here. These are all keratinocytes, and they are going to be making keratin. And again, they were derived from the stratum basale, and then they begin to migrate towards the surface of the skin. The next cell type that you will find in the stratum spinosum, although not as common, are something called Langerhans cells. Okay, those are these cells here. Langerhans cells are involved in the immune response. We talked about another function of skin being a surveyor of anything that shouldn't be, monitoring what is on our skin. And so these cells can mount an immune response if something is on our skin that should not be. All right. So what is happening is as these keratinocytes are making keratin, okay, so in the stratum spinosum, they start to make keratin. I'm going to change my color here. When they arrive at the stratum granulosum, so again, they are migrating upward, they start to begin to package the keratin in little bundles or little granules. And that is something that you can see under the microscope. They take on an appearance, they have a granular appearance to them, okay? Once you get to the stratum lucidum, okay, these cells are dead. So what is happening is the keratinocytes, after they have bundled the keratin, they release all of their contents out. So they release their organelles, they release their nucleus. They're basically empty cells at this point, and they are dead. So pretty much from the stratum lucidum and up, this is all dead cells. So again, they have a clear appearance. The stratum lucidum has a clear appearance. It is only present in thick skin. Again, I'll show you the difference between thick and thin skin in a minute. And then what happens is you have layers upon layers of dead keratinocytes that produce the stratum corneum. All right, and that is what generally will flake off over time, and the whole cycle will repeat itself. So as I mentioned, I have most of this written out for you. So each slide talks about each of the layers. So the stratum basale, that is the single layer that is the deepest, and they are capable of mitosis. They are adjacent to the dermis, so they are sitting on top of the dermis. And the cell types that you can find in the stratum basale include the keratinocytes, the keratinoblasts, the melanocytes, and then the Merkel cells, which are also called tactile cells. Again, the keratinocytes are the most abundant. They are producing keratin to protect and waterproof the skin. The melanocytes, those are the cell type that produce the pigment melanin, which absorb UV light to prevent DNA damage. And then the Merkel cells are also in the stratum basale. They are sensitive to touch, and they relay that information to our brain. So that is the stratum basale, what it is, and what the functions of it. And these are a single layer of cuboidal cells. right, up from that is the stratum spinosum. This was several layers thick. These are now non-dividing keratinocytes. And again, keratinocytes are the most abundant cell in this layer, most abundant or predominant. There are Langerhans cells, these are immune cells that help fight infection. They have the ability, they are phagocytes, meaning they go around like Pac-Man and they can gobble up things that shouldn't be there, as well as initiate an immune response. The next layer was the stratum granulosum. Again, under the microscope, these cells appear to contain granules. They can be 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes. The cytoplasm is now filled with keratin, okay? And they start to organize into little granules. And this is what is going to form the waterproofing barrier. The stratum lucidum, the key part here is that it is only present in thick skin. This is a thin, translucent region, okay, because at this point, the cells have kind of spit out all of their organelles and the nucleus. They are just empty membranes kind of at this point. They are dead. I'm going to go on to show you that, again, there is a difference between thick and thin skin, but I want you to be able to recognize it under the microscope. But just kind of to give you a hint, thick skin is only present in 2 locations on our body. On the palms of our hands and the surface of our digits, and the soles of our feet, and the surface of the toes. And the cells lack organelles, and I don't actually, this is probably too much information, and they are getting ready to release keratin. And then the stratum corneum, it's the most superficial layer of the epidermis. So the thickness varies. It can be anywhere from 20 to 30 cell layers thick, depending on the location. It is comprised solely of dead keratinocytes. So in this particular, we talked about how the corneum is stratified squamous cells. In this situation, these squamous cells have a name, and they are keratinocytes. And they are dead, and they are sloughed off by abrasion. All right, this is a really great histology image showing you, so here is the epidermis. And what we will be doing in lab is zooming in on this epidermis and trying to make out each of these stratums. So this very first cell layer at the bottom here, that is the stratum basale. They are cuboidal cells. They are only 1 cell layer thick. The next area is the stratum spinosum, here to here. All right, the stratum granulosum typically stains a little darker. That's what you see here and here. The stratum lucidum, it's supposed to be clear. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's kind of hard to see it here, but there is what should be a stratum lucidum if we are looking at thick skin, and then this very large stratum corneum. I was going to spell it out, but there's no need to because it's right here. And this is nice and thick. And you can see some of these layers are starting to slough off as the dead skin does. All right, let's talk about, since I've been alluding to this for what seems like a while now, what is the difference between thick and thin skin? So I think I'll go over thick and thin skin, and then I will make a second video that goes over sweat glands and hair follicles. So let's wrap this up by talking about thick and thin skin. So I already mentioned that thin skin covers most of our body. It contains only 4 of the strata, not the stratum lucidum, and it is about as thick as a plastic sandwich bag, okay? And we are referring to only the epidermis when we were talking about thick and thin skin. Do not be confused and think that we are talking about the dermis or the hypodermis. We are only talking about the epidermis when we are mentioning thick and thin skin. Thick skin, which I just talked about, is found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. It contains 5 of the strata because it has the stratum lucidum. That is the distinction. That is the distinctive layer that is found in thick skin, the stratum lucidum, and it is about as thick as a paper towel because we often damage our hands and feet, so they tend to be, the skin tends to be a little thicker. I want to show you an image, and I think that's about where I'm going to leave off. So this is an image here. This is thick skin. This is thin skin. These are the same magnification, okay? So you can see that in the thick skin image, the epidermis is quite large compared to the epidermis of thin skin, okay? It goes about from here to here. Let me change my color so you can see it a little better. So it's all the way here. The stratum corneum is quite large. This is the stratum corneum. So this can be 75 layers thick. It is quite thick compared to thin skin. Thin skin, excuse me, you actually have to zoom in to begin to see the different layers and the different stratums, okay? So again, same magnification. You can see the difference between thick skin and thin skin. Another difference, and this slide is quite busy, but all I want you to really just the take-home message of this slide is that thin skin contains hair follicles, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture, and thick skin is hairless. There is one other feature of thick and thin skin that I want you to understand. We spent just a few minutes talking about the difference between the epidermis, all right? There is also a difference between the dermis. So the epidermis of thick skin, the epidermis of thick skin is quite large. It's quite thick, I should say thick. The epidermis of thin skin is quite thin. But I also want you to take a look at the size of the dermis of each. So the dermis of thin skin is quite thick, and the dermis of thin skin, let me just back up and make sure I'm saying this right. The dermis of thin skin is quite thick, and the dermis of thick skin is quite thin. So please make sure that you understand what layers are increased in thick and thin skin in terms of the epidermis as well as the dermis. I don't want you to get fooled here. This sometimes is a harder concept for students, and I don't want you to miss this. So please take a look at the thickness of both the epidermis and the dermis in both thin and thick skin. And then we will follow up in the second part of this lecture talking about hair follicles and sweat glands.